Good evening, Dubai. Good afternoon, New York City, and good morning, California. My name is Bart Ziegler, and I'm the president of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. We welcome you to this first Friday series webinar, all the way live from Dubai. It's a very exciting time for us. It's a very exciting time for the world. Our foundation uses art, science, and education to inspire and address serious problems in the world. And it couldn't be a more timely time. It couldn't be a more timely period to invite you to this webinar. I'd like to turn it over to Lance Gould, who's former senior editor of Huffington Post and now is the CEO of Brooklyn Story Labs. Lance, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bart, and welcome to all. Today, myself, as Bart mentioned, and all of our guests for the program are in the United Arab Emirates, which is the host country for the UN's annual climate conference. The conference has many names. It is officially the UNFCCC, which stands for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is also officially known as COP28. COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and this is the 28th COP. The COP ecosystem dates back to the 1992 UN Earth Summit conference in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, which I had the good fortune to attend. And so we will be looking at this year's conference through the lens of more than 30 years of developments in the climate and sustainability space. This is also a critical conference for a number of reasons. Average global temperatures are on a trajectory to go well past the 1.5 degrees Celsius that scientists have warned us is a potential breaking point for sustainable living on the planet. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has jumped up and down for attention, noting that we could double 1.5 with a 3 degrees Celsius rise unless we take critical action. And yet, the president of this year's conference is also the CEO of the Emirates' largest oil company. And the oil industry will have a larger presence at this year's conference than ever before, which gives many pause. But our guests tonight are each working on solutions, and so we will hear from each of them and the promise of hope that they potentially can contribute to the challenges we face. We'll also take questions from the audience. So make sure that you get those questions into us via the webinar apparatus. So let's go meet our guest. Joining us today or tonight, because it is 11:30 p.m. here in Dubai, and we may have some sleepy guests, and we thank them for staying up late with us. We have Deirdre White, who is the CEO of the international development nonprofit Pixera Global. Joining Deirdre is Neon Murray, a young entrepreneur from Trinidad and Tobago, who is the CEO of Nezus Energy. So everyone, just give a wave when we mention you. We're also pleased to have Noah Gaffney, a professor at Columbia University's Climate School, very accomplished. We have Francois Rogers, who is executive director of the nonprofit Blue Planet Alliance, which is a partner of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. And finally, we have a very special guest, Lord Fatafaka Fanua, who is, did we lose Neon? Lord Fatafaka Fanua, who is Speaker of Parliament for the island nation of Tonga. Lord Fakafanua first assumed that role at the age of 27, currently serving his third term as Speaker of Parliament. He is still the youngest presiding officer in any parliamentary body in the world. So welcome to all. First, we'd love to hear a little bit more about what each panelist is working on, and specifically what they're working on at COP. And then we'll have a follow-up session after that first round of questions, and we'd like to hear about their impressions and expectations of COP. So Deirdre, let's start with you. Pixera Global has a number of initiatives around the world, including a new one that sounds very exciting. First, tell us a little bit about Pixera, and then about this new initiative.
Sure. Thanks so much, Lance, for making this opportunity possible. And thanks to everyone who's here late this evening speaking. Just thrilled to be part of this company. So Pixera Global, as you mentioned, we are an international not-for-profit organization. We've been around for 33 years now, under a variety of different names, but we work all across the globe, but we really live at sort of the intersection between the public, private, and social sectors. So, our mission is solving the world's most pressing problems, one community at a time. We really take a very community centric approach to everything we do. And that means listening to communities, understanding from them, and then really utilizing our unique networks and reach across the world to access resources from the public, private, and social sectors that can help communities to address the specific challenges they're having. So, coming from that space, the reason we're at COP is because there is no community anywhere in the world that is not challenged by, negatively impacted by the climate crisis in some way. And while this is our first outing at COP, we thought that it was really important to be here this year in particular to be able to explore the partnerships that are possible. That's a little bit about Pixar Global more broadly. And then you just asked about the Partnership for Digital Justice. This is something we're working on that I am so incredibly excited about. This is really fresh off the presses news. But what we were trying to achieve with the Partnership for Digital Justice is to take a new lens at looking at the digital divide. So everyone's talking about the digital divide. This is nothing that is a surprise, except that generally when we speak about it, people think either about access to broadband, access to internet, or access to the actual technology to be able to reach the digital world, or digital skills. And what we've really identified over the last years, inspired by our partners at Tropics Media and the Baeza Family Foundation, is there's this whole other space in the digital divide, which is missing information, missing cultural heritage. So, if you think for a minute about the global north, very, very broadly defined, let's say wealthier nations, better resourced nations, archives in those nations are being digitized at breakneck speed, and they have been for decades now. And archives in lesser resource nations simply aren't being digitized at that speed. And what we forget about in that happening is that as we depend more and more on the digital world for our understanding of the world and its history and its culture and its language, we're limiting ourselves more and more every day to just what wealthier interests have the ability to digitize. And so, there's this disbalance of information happening. There's this colonization of information that's happening more and more every day. And we know we can bring together the right partners to address this really critical and urgent question.
So it sounds like there's a bifurcated opportunity here with the Partnership for Digital Justice. On the one hand, you're preserving and protecting cultural heritage, archives, records, artifacts, things of that nature, and archiving and saving and protecting and preserving that information and that wisdom. Some of which, if it disappeared, could have the solutions that we need in hand. On the other side of it is also the AI component, because as you mentioned, we're depending more and more on AI every day. And so AI is only as intelligent as the sources from which it pulls. So tell us a little bit more about the digital component of this effort, the second half of that.
Yeah, I think where AI comes into this is there's been a lot of conversation, particularly over the last year or two, is when I started to hear it most about the bias that's inherent in AI. And when we talk about the bias in AI, a lot of the conversation is around who's actually programming it. I think the much bigger bias there is what is the information that actually is out there. And again, as each one of us depends more and more, whether we do it intentionally or whether by default, as each one of us depends more and more on AI every day in terms of how we learn about how we access the world, that missingness of information just gets greater. So that's why I say that this is such an urgent problem from an information disbalance perspective. But it's also really urgent, as you said, Lance, because I do believe firmly, and I think we're going to see this come out more and more as this information comes to the fore, that there are solutions to some of the world's greatest problems that are hidden in places that we haven't been able to access because they haven't been digitized. And so this is not just about digital. This is not just about scanning or preserving audiovisual archives. That's all really important, but it's also important to make sure we're doing the right tagging of that data so that it becomes searchable in a larger way. And one last thing I just want to say about it that's around the urgency is where we're really starting this journey in many ways is with a heavy focus on island nations and on indigenous communities, because that's where we feel like this information is at the greatest risk of being lost. Lost to the ravages of climate, lost to just the ravages of time and lack of preservation. And so, yeah, it's a very urgent issue that not a lot of people have, in my experience, been talking about.
Well, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here at COP, and I'm so glad you're unveiling this at COP because there's so many climate implications for islands. And speaking of islands, our next guest, Neon, you're currently living in Canada, but you're from Trinidad and Tobago, which is a small island developing state. And it is there that you conducted research on a problem facing many island nations, sargassum seaweed. Please tell us about your research and what you're doing about that currently.
Yes, Lance. So, yes, I am currently residing in Canada. I'm actually finishing my graduate diploma in project management. And originally, hailing from Trinidad, I did my master's research in grass to energy, actually. But the adoption of the sargassum has been more prevalent in recent times because it's affecting most of the islands. And of course, finding sustainable solutions to this challenge posed by the accumulation of the sargassum along the coastlines.
Can you tell
Uh,
us a little bit about, like, for those not familiar with sargassum, like what it is and what the dangers are that it poses?
Okay, so like sargassum right now, because of the runoff from fertilizer, it's growing at an alarming rate. And every year around Easter time, it usually floats down and covers all the beaches. It rots. It produces a putrid smell. So it's a problem for tourism, fisheries. Yeah, it's really bad. But presently, I'm actively kind of planning like a youth project around the sargassum to address the issue comprehensively. Because, I mean, getting youth involved in the scientific part, because we have to try to understand like the seaweed itself, apart from using it for sustainable solutions. Furthermore, like I want to plan to implement an innovative process to utilize that sargassum. Um, this includes like drying it for fertilizer, so probably we could sell it, digesting it to produce biogas.
It looks like Neon is having some problems, but I'll just ask our producer Paul just to let me know when he's back up. In the meantime, we're going to move on to Noah. Noah, you are on the faculty at Columbia University's Climate School. Tell us more about your role there. It's a fascinating, new, relatively new division of an Ivy League school. And tell us what you're doing here in Dubai. So tell us first about Columbia and then what you're doing here in Dubai.
Sure. So I teach in the Sustainability Management program, which is a special master's degree for students who really want to make a difference in the world. And they're brilliant. They're some of the brightest minds. It's exciting to be able to bring some of the world's leaders to these students who are really the future sustainability leaders. So that's been a ton of fun. And I'm really grateful for my time there. In terms of what I'm doing at COP, my work really focuses on what I call inclusive impact, what some other people call the just transition. It's basically the idea that impact and inclusion are tied together. So we often talk about things like ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance issues, as siloed from diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And, these conversations are actually really important to connect with each other, as well as the role of innovation, because what we see, and I really focus on the role of business particularly, is that impact and inclusion are drivers of innovation, particularly in a world where we're facing so many challenges around climate, where we're facing so many other challenges around, inequality, et cetera, these are really going to be the keys to success.
It sounds like there's an analogous way to look at what you're doing and what Deirdre's doing with the Partnership for Digital Justice. With Deirdre, there's a lot of wisdom that could be lost and may hold some of the solutions for the future that if we ignore them or at our own peril. And similarly with diversity and inclusion, all the perspectives that we're missing at the table that, as you said, lead to innovation. Tell us a little bit more about that on a granular level.
Sure. So we actually oversimplify diversity. I have a framework around 10 types of diversity, right? We often think about it as, sexual orientation or gender, ethnicity, et cetera. But there are all sorts of hidden diversities and diversities that we don't necessarily think about when it comes to the fore, right? So things like political beliefs, things like age, things like socioeconomic background and lived experience, right? These are all things that may not necessarily be at the forefront when we meet somebody, but they really do help shape their life experiences and also expose them to different universes, right? And so I think it's really important that we take all of those into account.
That's wonderful. And so in this new project that you have, which I believe is called the Inclusive Impact Initiative, tell us more about that endeavor and how you hope to grow it, what the climate implications are, and things of that nature.
So, the Inclusive Impact Initiative is a new initiative that's going to launch in 2024. And the goal is really to bring leaders across sectors together to focus on that intersection across impact, inclusion, and innovation, talking about them as drivers for growth as opposed to sources of things that are weighing us down, right? So we know that there's a huge backlash around environmental social governance issues or ESG. We know there's a backlash on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of that is political, some of that is corporate. And so I think we really need to change the conversation and change the tone and say, actually, these are hugely positive things with many positive implications for solving the challenges that we're facing today. So the Inclusive Impact Initiative focuses on 4 pillars. They are green innovation, inclusive AI, worker well-being, and conflict resolution. And I think these are really timely issues. There's a climate angle to all of them. And what I'm really excited about is having deep conversations with experts on all 4 of those pillars, but also those cross-cutting conversations across the pillars throughout the course of next year.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad that you and Deirdre are on the same program, because that sounds like there's some collaboration ahead for those 2 organizations. Let's go back to Francois from Blue Planet Alliance. Francois, Blue Planet Alliance is at what I believe is its 3rd consecutive COP. Tell us more about what Blue Planet Alliance does.
Yeah, so Blue Planet Alliance is we originated out of Hawaii. The entire Blue Planet organization was responsible for setting the standard for 100% renewable energy goal. We made sure Hawaii was the first state to mandate a 100% renewable energy goal for electricity. So the alliance was born a few years from now in 2020 to replicate what we've done in Hawaii and see if we could help other island nations around the world.
So it's really, as I understand it, and from working with you, Hawaii was the first state to pass a mandate legally requiring it to transition to 100% renewable energy by 2045, a landmark bill. 20 states or so have followed suit, and now Blue Planet Alliance exists to replicate that success with other countries around the world. Tell us how that works. Recently, I believe Blue Planet Alliance launched a game-changing initiative called the Blue Planet Alliance Fellowship Program, in which BPA brought representatives from 8 island nations and territories to Hawaii. Tell us more about that program.
Yeah, it was a new initiative we launched in October this year. The idea is that if most of the experts are in Hawaii, it'll be more beneficial for people to hear from them firsthand and take that knowledge back to their islands. But I think the fellowship program was designed more in a sense to say, okay, it's easy to tell them what we've done, but it's more to understand what each jurisdiction is going through today and how do we come up with solutions that is applicable to each jurisdiction. In case of, for instance, right now I'm going back and forth with Cayman Islands, who is part of our fellowship program, and they're going through similar situations like we did 15 years ago, where the utility is completely denying that any scientific findings and any resolution that we wrote together in Hawaii is irrelevant to the Cayman Islands. So we're trying to find a way to rebuttal every denying comments that is brought to us, and see how it does. I think um, the simplest analogy that I have is that it's not easy to wear our slippers. We all have slippers every year, and I think sometimes we have to wear shoes, and sometimes leather shoes. And I think figuring out what type of shoe fits the best for each of this jurisdiction is what we're trying to figure out together. So it's essentially building a network of islands that will be working together, learning from each other, and how do we grow that going forward is the program's directive. Yeah.
To me, it's so game changing because it seems that the UN IPCC report says we have to move away from from fossil fuels, or we face potentially negative, irreversible negative consequences. So great, how do we do that? And Hawaii has done that. Hawaii has set a path forward for other countries to follow. And if we can bring islands, countries to Hawaii to learn at their feet, it's a potentially game changing possibilities of bringing dozens of islands to Hawaii and putting them on their own 100% paths. You mentioned something a second ago about the Cayman Islands and how um, the cohort that came from the Cayman Islands is now struggling still with the utility on that island. You had a similar scenario in Hawaii where the utility and your group that was advocating for 100% renewable energy were kind of at odds. So tell us, how was that overcome?
Well, we started in a time when nobody was talking about renewable energy. I think that's the biggest challenge we had in Hawaii in 2007 or 8 ish. Um, Renewable energy or saving the environment was more of a political punchline where politicians would say that to get into office, but no real action was taken. So I think for us, it was changing the conversation and seeing how we could actually do it. Our founder, Hank Rogers, who is not here today, would always say that, he suggested 100% renewable energy for Hawaii because it is the right thing to do so. But I think a lot of the people are like, they thought he was a little bit crazy. That nobody's really thinking about what are you really talking about. So I think for us it took us quite a while because we were the first state, or the first jurisdiction in anywhere to really like push 100% mandate going forward. And I think that was a big thing. But again, I think what we learned from the fellowship is that not everybody's problem is similar in every way. Um, Hawaii has a utility company that oversees three of our four counties, and Kauai has its own utility co-op, and so it's very different and very jurisdiction within the state itself to begin with. But how do we overcome that obstacles is what we've sort of put our task to. So I think that's the thing. Like the fellowship came to Hawaii, and what we learned quickly is that we do have a utility company that is not owned by the government, but like in cases of American Samoa, that is owned by the government. So it is easy to say decentralize all the solar panels and have rooftop solars and whatnot, but that in direct translation means we're bankrupting the utility company because they're not going to be able to generate business. So it is a balance between how do we sustain the utility for who they are by converting them into making a better energy choice. And I think that is the bottom line, right? How do we set the ambition going forward? How we set an end date and work backwards by understanding and analyzing what each jurisdiction is facing today and it's not always the same type of obstacle. And how do we come up with the the solution to it, which to us is an opportunity? How do we
You've
see
brought up so many great points. One is that sometimes you don't have to have all the answers to get going, because if you set a goal for 100%, even if the technology isn't there, then the technology can come. And that goes back to what Noah was talking about in terms of innovation. You also mentioned that one of the utility, there's the main utility company, and then for the island of Kauai, you said there's a cooperative, and Deirdre has a cooperative program that maybe she'll talk about next. But in the meantime, let's bring on Lord Whakafanua, who was a member of the cohort that took place in that fellowship program that Blue Planet Alliance did. But we'll talk about something else first. Lord Whakafanua, first, welcome and thanks for being here with us today and tonight, and for agreeing to be with us. I really appreciate, you know how busy you are. Tonga is a small island developing state in the Pacific. Small island developing states like Tonga are the least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change, but the most vulnerable to them. Your neighbors, Tuvalu and Kiribati, both UN member states like yourself, are under serious threat of rising sea levels. Tell us about some of the projects now in the works that Tonga has to combat the threat that you face. And we'll talk about the Blue Planet Alliance Fellowship Program later.
Thank you, Lance. So Tonga, as you know, is a big ocean state. And I like to say big ocean state because it spells boss, unlike what people usually use, which is large ocean state, and that spells loss. So I prefer boss to loss. But we're
Spoken like a boss.
So Tonga is the third most vulnerable country to natural disasters and external shocks. That's according to the 2021 World Risk Index report. So it's been verified independently that we are in the forefront of more extreme weather events, and we're very vulnerable to them. And in contrast, our contribution to climate change, the carbon emissions that we create and leave on the planet, is but a drop in the ocean. So in terms of like equitable treatment, we are seeing and feeling the effects of global climate change, and we are not at fault for it. Yet we are paying a hefty price. In Tonga, we have to look at mitigation, just because if we expect the rest of the world to mitigate against climate change, we have to do it ourselves as well, even though what the carbon offsetting that we'll be doing is not that much in comparison. But in terms of projects, we're looking at renewable energies like solar, wind, wave, even thermal potentially, ocean tech, some sort of hydro through the lagoon, even though we don't have mountains, rivers, and nuclear power. But more concretely, in 2018, Tropical Cyclone Gita destroyed our Parliament building. And so as a practical measure, we've moved the Parliament precinct from the shoreline into higher ground. And if that's not symbolic of what needs to happen, I don't know what is. Our democratic base is being uprooted from where it's traditionally been for the past 100 years. And now we're going to rebuild on a new site that is more resilient because it's higher, so that it could weather itself from saltwater intrusion and any future tsunamis or any water inundation that it could have suffered if it was still on the shoreline. As Speaker of Parliament,
such a poignant analogy.
Yeah, so as Speaker of Parliament, that's probably the closest project that comes to mind, apart from developments looking at more resilient crops because the weather systems have changed, weather patterns have changed. The normal crops that we rely on for food security need to be relooked at because they're becoming more unreliable. And so that's an immediate impact on food security. We also have to look at future potential sources of water. Water is also a food security issue. So we're exploring exciting developments, new technologies for deep sea desalination, being mindful of the externalities around that with the environment. But we've found something that we think is suitable for small island developing states, a deep sea technology for desalination that uses 40% less power, uses no land because it's completely submerged, and has zero brine, which is amazing because we don't want to negatively impact the biosphere, the ecosystems around our coral reefs, which are already strained by the warming temperatures in the ocean that are bleaching corals, stressing them, and that would also have a major impact on the local ecosystem and fisheries and biodiversity in the ocean. So that's sort of the adaptation measures that we're looking at. Adaptation is very costly because they are long-term infrastructure projects, so there is no real return on investment like mitigation plans. When you put in a solar farm, you get a tariff rate and there's a return on the investment, but there's not really a return on investment in terms of investment for reclamations or relocations or building a seawall. It's hard to commercialize that. But the reality is that's what we need to do. We need to have more science and research into more resilient crops and food security. We need financing and grant donors for water desalination for water security. And we need seawalls to protect people's livelihoods and their homes.
Well, it sounds like that just in terms of making connections, there's already so much possibility of you collaborating with Pixera Global on the cultural side, but also with what NOAA is doing in terms of innovation. It sounds like with great problems and with your back up against the wall, it sounds like you're coming up with some really amazing innovative possibilities. I wasn't aware of the Parliament moving. And if anyone watching out there is thinking that this is that's a small island developing state problem because they had their parliament on the shoreline on a small Pacific state, think about Vermont, which is long thought of to be one of the most safe and climate resistant states in the U.S. Their capital, Montpelier, was completely washed out by an overflowing river, the Wisniewski River, this summer, and they may have to move their capital. So this is a global problem, and I'm so glad, Lord Whakawhenua, that you're here at COP to discuss it. Now, just to follow up, Lord, if we could talk a little bit about your experience at Blue Planet Alliance and the fellowship program, because Francois just mentioned this great program, but you were actually there participating in it. So you're among the first cohort, and you were there as a participant. Tell us about the experience and in that program, being able to learn from other islands and workshop some of the problems that were faced and what Tonga's trajectory looks like for transitioning to renewable energy.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm happy to talk about Blue Planet Alliance because really it was groundbreaking for a lot of the participants. It gave us the opportunity to learn from Hawaii's extensive experience in decarbonizing. And I think what that conference offered a lot of us from Pacific Islands that attended was the opportunity to leapfrog some of the lessons so that we don't have to struggle as much.
Mine or his?
Sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. The producer had asked a question. I apologize.
I was just saying that the experience in Hawaii would allow us to leapfrog some of those issues and save costs and time and money, which a lot of islands have resource constraints on. And a lot of the experience that Hawaii has gone through will be invaluable in small island nations. It's easier for us to learn and adapt to Hawaii's lessons than to adapt something that was experienced in a much different environment, like, say, New York or Kansas, where it's completely out of context on an island setting. So Blue Planet Alliance came into the foray for Tonga sort of at a time where we needed a Blue Planet Alliance. We embarked on our energy roadmap in 2010 with a comprehensive roadmap called the Tonga Energy Roadmap. And it was designed to achieve 50% renewable energy by 2020. And come 2021, we had only achieved 18% renewable energy penetration. But Tonga is quite ambitious, even though we didn't have the means to achieve the target. We created a 70% target to achieve by 2025. And in COP27, which was last year, we became the first country to sign the Blue Planet Alliance pledge to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2045. And so following on, after signing on to the Blue Planet pledge, we were invited, Tonga was invited to attend this fellowship. And I think it was quite clever because we were invited to bring someone from the legislature, someone from the regulator, someone from the utility, and someone representing the community. And I think we had the right people from each part of society to ensure that the targets and our ambitions are achieved in a realistic fashion. And Francois is quite good at organizing these events and actually following up and ensuring that we're doing our homework and actually following through with some of these ambitious plans.
That's great. Thank you. And I apologize if there's any bad internet here. Again, I think we're in a hotel where the internet is being utilized very heavily by all the almost 100,000 delegates who are attending COP. So if there's any technical issues from anybody, we can't tell if that's happening. So I'm getting a whisper in my ear that from the producer that there may be some issues. So if there are, please bear with us. We're just doing our best, but there may be connectivity issues that we're dealing with. So thanks to all for sharing their current projects. Now let's talk more about COP this year, a little on a granular level. This will be the first COP in which the global stocktake is revealed. The global stocktake is an important component of the COP process that came out of COP21, 193 member states that signed the agreement, which was all of them, to come up with a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These plans, which are voluntary and which every country has, including Tonga, are called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. But we know very little about how far along each country is in their NDC trajectories, and we will finally find out this year, or that was just revealed just before COP started through the global stocktake process. So how important is knowing how far everyone is in holding their feet to the fire to make sure that we get to where we are? Neon, let's start with you. Tell us what you think about the global stocktake and how that will help.
Okay, so global stocktake, I mean, it stemmed from the Paris Agreement and its NDCs. It certainly has marked like a crucial milestone in climate accountability. So the key decisions and global agreements can be made at this space, like COP, but political will at a national level is also extremely pivotal in driving this, achievement of the NDCs. And myself coming from SIDS, Trinidad and Tobago, in the Caribbean, the adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund after over a decade-long fight is the key to the region having financial resources and breaking that economic barrier of achieving our NDCs and a just transition without compromising social needs.
That's a really great point about political will, Neon, and that's one thing that can't be scientifically generated. That has to be applied by people. Anybody else want to weigh in on this particular thought on global stocktake?
Lance, I actually wanted to weigh in on the loss and damage, if I
Absolutely.
could. So
Absolutely.
first of all, like probably every one of us here, I did a little happy dance last night, because it's so important for this acknowledgement of the damage, of the way that we consume, and that policy is made, in wealthier nations affects the rest of the world. So the acknowledgement of that is great. Um, but I also just, as one of the world's greater optimists, I got to register my deep disappointment at the low starting point that we're at with this, right? And I know it's a starting point, so we all have to have a starting point. But we're talking, a lot of the estimates say there's around $400 billion worth of damage that is done to less wealthy nations every year by climate change. So what was promised yesterday, and I'm going to look particularly at my own nation, the United States, is dreadfully inadequate. um, and I want to, and it's dreadfully inadequate from the perspective of the fund itself. And then also, I want to take a little exception to the instrument that we're using in order to collect and distribute this money, because while I understand the value of using World Bank structures because that's what the governments could agree to, these structures are part of what has gotten us into the challenge that we're in. And so I have a deep fear, that those funds are not going to be able to be distributed in an equitable way at the speed in which they need to be distributed. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, speaking of holding feet to the fire, right, to hold the world's feet to the fire in terms of contributing more here, and in terms of actually being certain that these funds are distributed, and utilized as rapidly as possible. We don't have time to mess around with the historical procurement structures that have been in place.
Those are such great points, Deirdre, and you anticipated my next question, because my next question, although you added a perspective that uh, a healthy skepticism, even from one of the world's most optimistic people, such as yourself, about what this will actually mean. But what I was going to ask the group is, this particular COP is taking place in a petrostate. The president of the conference is also the CEO of the nation's largest oil company. And for the first time in the history of COPs, the oil industry will have its own pavilion. So these are things to be wary of. And yet yesterday, as you mentioned, on the first day of COP, there was a breakthrough moment. The loss and damage fund was adopted, and it's certainly paltry in where it could be, but I do believe it is a start, committing wealthier nations to help poorer nations navigate the complexities of fighting climate change. And the host country donated 100 million to that new fund. Now, the skeptic in me thinks, okay, 100 million is nothing for a country that is making side deals on oil business at COP, and that is something that came out. And yet we, as journalistically, I want to ask the group: are we making too much of the oil connection here, or are those alarming factors in time where we are facing critical deadlines and the need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels? We know we have to get. It's probably not that difficult of a question to answer, but I would love to hear how you guys think of this. So, Francois, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, it's an interesting question actually. I mean, it might be relevant or not relevant what I say here, but I think because I think Lord, you kind of mentioned it earlier, but for us the timing was critical in Hawaii, but it was also in a day of age where nobody really cared about it. So when we always say this lightly, which it should be thought out really deeply, is that we went backwards 5 years. Like it took us 5 years to realize that we all need to do the right thing going forward. And and then we realized that okay, we need to introduce a bill. Then it took another 3 years. So 8 years of our lives pushing this forward was kind of lost in translation. And I think it's now that the utility is on board that we're kind of on the same pathway or the direction of where we need to be at. So I think we don't wish upon that on any islands or any countries in the world to have to go through that. Recognize the elephant in the room and tackle at its own. I think that's really key where we see it. So, yeah, I think there's many ways of looking at the discussion we're having today, but for us as an alliance, set the goal. I mean, that's the main thing we always say is like, if you don't have a goal, you're never going to achieve anything. It doesn't matter if it's energy or any other issue in the world. And that's what we do is about setting the climate ambition to make sure that all the problems and the worries and anxieties are alleviated, and how do we get to the next level. So everything that's happening at COP and the discussion Deidre just mentioned, everything that we're talking about today is about, yeah, it's easy to say who's responsible for what not, but I think going forward we need to realize on how do we actually get to that point where we need to be at, and then more importantly, how do we execute that? I think
Right.
that's
Setting a goal and then getting yourself on the path onto a trajectory. So you're saying, if I'm not mistaken, what you're saying is ignore the noise, just focus on setting a goal and taking care of it, getting it done. Is that accurate? To
well, I wouldn't say ignore the noise because it's not actually noise. The concerns that you hear from the islands is real, and I mean, Lord will know this, like we talked about this at the fellowship program, is that every concern and every anxiety that we face together is a real concern to each island. And it's not that they don't know, that's not that we don't know how to do it. It's that there are concerns, there are knowledges that we need to learn, and we need to all be in the same path to alleviate those concerns. Like if you take an electric vehicle today, right? There's a terminology. Well, what is the new terminology we use today? It's called um, it's called what was it called again? It's called mileage anxiety, right? It's
Mhm.
basically the anxiety that you're not going to be able to fuel your car in time so you could get to the point, which is actually, if you really think about it, it's a really a crazy concept because how you're not going to drive your car to the ground and oil today. You're going to drive enough to reach the next gas station. So to me, it's just a concept of if the infrastructure is in place, then you will plan ahead and make sure your EV is charged ahead, and don't drive them more than 30 miles today because that's all you have in a tank. That's all you have in a
Right.
tank.
Mm.
So
And the Build Back Better plan that Biden was talking about did have a provision for a national infrastructure for electric vehicle charging.
but
Does anybody else want to weigh in on this topic?
yeah.
Can I weigh in,
Yeah, please
Lance?
go ahead, Lord.
So I think what Francois was talking about is that we shouldn't be distracted by the politics. Um, Ultimately, we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And I'm happy that, here in Dubai, they reaffirmed that because in COP27, when we heard that the next COP was going to be in Dubai, an oil pumping nation, um, there was going to be a major risk of sliding the 1.5 to 2 or 3, which is a death sentence. And I think the fact that we're hearing from the islands, that's just symptomatic of what's coming for the planet. And it's not going to end here. If we don't stop it now, what islands are experiencing today, everyone else will feel in the world more drastically and more. It'll be more relevant in your lives if you think you're isolated from this. And so, in order for us to achieve the 1.5, we need more ambitious NDCs, nationally determined contributions, which are voluntary on the countries. And that's where the political will is critical because if countries don't have the political will, they'll have weak NDCs. And that's the mechanism there to reduce carbon emissions. And for some countries, we can't afford to be as ambitious with our NDCs. And that's where the financing comes in. So, there was that promise in, was it 2019? where the developed countries and the more wealthy countries promised $100 billion a year. We're nowhere near that.
Yeah, that was in Copenhagen in 2009, I believe.
2009, yeah, we're nowhere near that target. I mean, if we had the means back then, we would be nowhere near the 1.5 today. And what we need now, more than ever, and for COP28 to be successful in Dubai, we need a clear decision on phasing out of fossil fuels. And I think one mechanism that's available for doing that is to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. An IMF report from this year measured fossil fuel subsidies at $7 trillion, and that was 2022, last year. $7 trillion. I mean, all we needed was $100 billion since 2009 or 19, I can't remember what it was, but $7 trillion is 7.1% of global GDP. That far outweighs how much the world is spending on education. I mean, not to mention how much we're spending worldwide globally on arms. That's in the trillions. But fossil fuel subsidies, if we can somehow reallocate that resource into carbon decarbonizing, it's more than enough money to do it.
Into innovation, like what NOAA's doing. Imagine if it took that $7.1 trillion that was that the World Economic Forum had estimated was subsidizing the fossil fuel industry and put it toward innovation. We'd potentially be in a much different state. We'd be further along the road. You're absolutely right. And what I love is
that's within the realm of reality, Lance, because we're not talking about new money. We're not talking about new taxations. This is taxpayer money that's funding climate change through fossil fuels. It's taxpayers' money. People paying for the degradation of the environment. That's the insanity around it. So I think instead of raising new capital, instead of calling taxes, we just use the existing resources that are currently being allocated to fossil fuels.
And I just add to the point where Lord is saying right now that phasing out is really key. I mean, we in Hawaii we started out by the lowest hanging fruit, which is efficiency, and one of the main things we did is just slowly phasing out light bulbs from the shelves of this, from every of the stores. And we started with light bulbs and we did different things, but like more recently, ironically, it was during Christmas time last year, is that we phased out coal. There's no more coal plants. For our last coal shipment into Hawaii, and we completely phased out. So sometimes you do have to phase out or never to build a new fossil fuel plant or generator, and you have to phase that out, take it out of the system. And once it's out of the system, then you're forced to make the right decisions and reallocate all the funding that where it needs to go to, which is to the Lord's point.
Perfect point. And Francois, following up on your point, there was $6 billion a year, which what Hawaii was spending every year on dirty energy. And now with this renewable energy plan that they have, all that money will be kept in the local Hawaiian economy. It's a win-win-win. I want to make sure we hear from Noah. Bart, let's go to Bart for a second and see if we have any questions from the audience. And then maybe Noah, you could tackle the first question from the audience.
Oh, yeah. And Lord, it was great that you brought up the 7 trillion it's fossil fuel subsidies. That I was listening to Simon Teal, the executive secretary, on his very powerful talk about the need for, but it's not at any cost. I have to let you know that our foundation has found nuclear energy to be way too expensive, way too long to build. And we just saw recently at the Fukushima dump, they're about to unload a 250 million gallons of contaminated radioactive wastewater. And the island nations are the ones who will suffer because pollution ends up not being the solution. It drifts around the ocean, and then you have, but anyway, so one of the questions that came here was, you all mentioned the importance of political will. What do you think is the most important for fostering that drive to actually do the right thing? around the world and across sectors, from innovative to scientific? Who wants that question?
Let's give that to Noah, just because I'd love to hear more from her.
So I think it's really interesting having that question in a place like COP because most people would say it's top down. We have to work with the heads of state, we have to work with the CEOs. And yes, that's true. But really, the biggest thing with political will is citizen engagement, right? So that's really what's going to move the needle. That's what's going to change that 7 trillion in spending in subsidies because it's no longer going to be acceptable by citizens, right? And so I think it's really about getting that groundswell, and obviously, the days of the climate protests have waned, but I think there's something to be said for pragmatic action by citizens. And that's where I think it's going to be key. And then the other thing around political will is just, how can we make it easy for people and governments and individuals to drive change, right? And I think, to the point earlier about phasing out, it's also about what can we phase in and how do we make sure that there's enough innovation in the ecosystem to drive that change. And so I think especially in different contexts where, for example, parts of Africa, rural parts of Africa are still off grid, how do we make sure? I was talking to somebody today, and they were saying, why don't we have mini grids in rural communities, mini electric grids, right? So that people can actually get that energy source from their local community instead of, thinking about bringing large generators to those communities, right? So we need alternatives. We need them to be exciting and innovative and meaningful for those communities as well. And so I think it's really about that citizen engagement and those grassroots solutions.
Such a great point, Noah. And just to follow up on your point about Africa, the Europe Africa Earthshot conference that took place earlier this year noted that of the 54 countries in Africa, every country was getting a rating from this one nonprofit that I can't remember the name of. And they rated the potential of renewable energy from that country. And there was super abundant, abundant. Those were categories in which you had more renewable energy available in that country than the demand. I think 1,000 times and 100 times, and then there were countries that were below that level where there was more demand than was available. Of the 54 countries in Africa, all but one were abundant or super abundant, and all the countries in Europe were below. So if there's a way to bring European capital into African projects and take advantage, I think they were saying the nation of Kenya alone might have enough energy to supply the entire world through 2040 if it was tapped, renewable energy, not fossil fuels, but wind and solar. So bringing having innovative thinking when it comes to just even partnering is something to think about. Anybody else want to weigh in on the political will question?
I could win a political will because we that's exactly what we went through in Hawaii. It's about the lack of political will was a really big thing that we faced in Hawaii. I think, but I think we did a lot of lobbying with the politicians and stuff, but it was more about educating and finding who is going to be the champion of that particular bill and having the person advocate through and through. Hawaii has 57 politicians on the legislature, including Senate and representatives. We are a Democratic state majority. There is 2% Republicans and 98% Democrats. But even then, we did face a lot of oppositions and a lot of different interests going forward. So I think changing the dialogue, changing the conversation, rebutting or even challenging some of the status quo was always the key winner in what we've done there. So we actually, because Hawaii hasn't had an example, we had to bring in experts from outside of the state to come to Hawaii, testify in front of the legislature, and challenge them on certain topics and how do we transition. And that was, and only then was the way we were able to change the conversation and sort of the head of the Senate or even the PUC would say to the utility, like, well, why are they saying differently when you're saying this way? So that was that way. The other thing that I just wanted to bring up quickly is that we also have we are working closely with the National Caucus of Environmental Leaders, who is a consortium of about 2,000 legislators throughout the entire country that we are part of, and they're learning from Hawaii's example, and other states have already passed a similar mandate. But having that annual convening or putting it together is really key. And Senator Chris Lee out of Hawaii is the vice chair of that national caucus. And I think it's key to see a Hawaii rep to actually go out there and actually influence other states. I think that's another way of actually saying there's enough precedent in the world. There's enough precedent. It's not something new anymore. The solution is here. The way to get there is there. It's all about how do you tell them that there's enough precedent out there that you could actually achieve it to alleviate all the anxiety and say that stop hiding behind the political divide and come to the conclusion that we could all do this together if we put our minds behind it.
That's a great point, Francois. And Chris Lee, who you just mentioned, who's now, I believe, the head of the National Caucus on Environmental Legislators, was on this program last month talking. He was also the author of the bill that Hawaii became law to make Hawaii the first state that went 100% renewable. And in his work, he noted that there is, although it's not always bipartisan, there is some bipartisan support for this. So again, like perhaps looking at political will is to find the common ground and find where there's collaboration, and instead of using divide, although that is a problem, but to try to find strength in where you can work together. We're coming up on time because the program does not have to be just an hour, but we are over an hour. So I want to ask, get one more question from the audience, and then have some final thoughts from our panelists. So Bart, do we have another question for the audience from the audience?
I just want to mention, though, this is when Deidre said something about connectivity. You had difficult connectivity, but the fact that I 10,000 miles away can say, good evening, Lance, and thank you for putting together such great communication, because really that's what it comes down to, communication. The 60% of developing nations don't have, I just lost the last question, Lance, but I just wanted to say that this is really a tremendous opportunity to talk about how important it is conversations and communication. And as Noah said, interaction, intersection, conflict resolution. This is just a great opportunity. I'll let you take it over, Lance.
Great, thank you, Bart. And I apologize for any connectivity issues on my part. As I said, I think there's a lot of demand for connectivity in this hotel and throughout the city. There's 100,000 delegates here who are very used to certain connectivity that in their homes, and they may not be getting that here. But this is part of the reality of being in this exciting conference. But let's go around the room, around the panel quickly, and say, let's end on a hopeful note. What gives you the most hope for a successful outcome, or a solution that you're working on, but or either one that one that's not the one that you're working on, but that you've heard about, and try to make it fairly quick because we're short on time. But Laura, let's start with you. Like, what gives you hope about the conference, or is there a program or innovation that you've heard about that gives you hope? Go ahead, Noah. Just take it away.
I was at a session earlier today with two African legends, Tony Elumelu and the head of the WTO. And she was talking about the need to support grassroots entrepreneurs across Africa. And it was really inspiring to hear a business leader and the head of this, UN World Trade Organization talking about the need to really support people at the grassroots. And so they're going to create a database of fundable projects across the continent. And that's something that gives me hope, because I think it's, when you're at this room and you're talking to billionaires and CEOs and heads of state and heads of international organizations, for them to say, actually, we're going to go to the grassroots and fund those projects, I think that's exactly where we need to go. So that makes me hopeful.
Amazing. Now, Lord, let's go to Lord Falk.
What makes me hopeful is that this is probably the largest COP. And the fact that there's so much interest means that this is in the forefront of everyone's mind. And evidently, I think there is more and more youth engagement, which is important, because I think that if we have buy-in from the youth, it means that we have concerned citizens. It means that there would be potentially more of a political will for all of this engagement to show fruit in the future. So, we can't talk about the future without talking about the youth. And at the end of the day, we're doing this for the unborn people of the future. So that sort of keeps me fuzzy and warm at night, knowing that we have a lot of concerned youth out there, and they're going to make this happen if we don't.
Spoken like the youngest parliamentarian in the world, the youngest parliamentary leader in the world. Thank you for that. Who should we go next? Let's go to Francois. What gives
Um,
you hope?
well, this is my third cup. I attended Glasgow for the first time ever, and when people ask me how was your first cup, my reaction was that every panel that I went to said that it's all about the youth and it's all about how they'll be in the driver's seat and whatnot. And age is defined between age 18 and 30. But my biggest takeaway from the first cup that I went to in Glasgow was that, well, when do they become drivers in the driver's seat? And because every time I walked in the room, they will talk about how they're in charge, it's their future, but they turn around and make a different decision. So it was a little disappointing in Glasgow, but I think what I can definitively say in the last two cups following that is that I think there is more youth that is more involved and the youth is more at the seat, they have a seat at the table. And I think that gives me a little bit of hope. I mean, Blue Planet brought a bunch of youth, including Neon here, Khadija from Trinidad as well, Francisco from Costa Rica, and a few other youth that are coming, Ashley from Barbados. And we see youth leaders now taking serious action, trying to be at the table to make sure that their message is loud and clear and be part of the process. And I think, I haven't seen too much this time yet, but I'm hopeful in a sense that if everybody is here and walking around this gigantic expo city of 100,000 people, I actually could see that there are more youth in the audience than my Glasgow days that I've seen it. So I think we're heading to the right direction, and as long as the youth is on top of what they want to do with their future, demand their future, I think we're in a better place. And I think it is our job to pass it down to make sure that the youth is in charge, that they are part of the process going forward. So I think that's kind of like my
That
sort of
sounds great, Francois. Thank you. And speaking of youth and Neon, we lost you for a bit, so we lost we lost an opportunity to talk about your Blue Planet Alliance global ambassadorship. But so I just want to put that out there. I think we'll have to move on from that. But that sets you up for what gives you hope.
Yeah. So what I mean, speaking on Blue Planet Alliance, that gives me hope. What gives me hope is actually, I was afforded the opportunity by Peace Corps US, a Blue Zone badge. I don't know and can't stress how hard it is for you to get a Blue Zone badge to these crucial, meetings, this conference on a whole cup. And Planet, I mean, for me, Blue Planet is like a genuine commitment because I am and based on renewable energy, that kind of thing. That 100% renewable energy by 2045. And piggybacking on what Lord had to say, as well as Francois, is not about the glitz and glam. I mean, I'm a Blue Planet Global Ambassador. I have youth younger than me looking up to me. You know, um, Youth are the future. People need to invest in the youth. Every conference I've been to this year, it's like there's a youth perspective, but then they turn to be like, you know, "Hey there, y'all are the future. Okay, cool. But when are we going to? I am the CEO of Nisus Energy. When am I going to walk into a room and not be called a youth? When we reach that stage, I will have more hope. But organization plan is both that give you opportunity to have a voice in these spaces. That's what gives.
Thank you, Neon, and apologies again. There were some connectivity issues, but one thing that you mentioned how difficult it was for youth to get Blue Zone passes. And just for the audience, the Blue Zone pass for COP is sort of like the Willy Wonka ticket, to get into all of the different meetings. And the Green Zone is for the public. And so it's very difficult for anyone to get into the Blue Zone. It's difficult for all of us to get Blue Zone passes. I think Lord Fakafanu is the only one who probably, as a country delegation, is guaranteed to have a seat at the table. But for the rest of us, it's very difficult to get a ticket. And so, Neon, that's such an excellent point.
I,
And Deirdre, I wanted to give Deirdre the last word here on what gives her hope, and then and then we'll have some wrap up language.
So I would just say, everything everyone else said, and then plus just honestly conversations like this one. So I'm really grateful to you, Lance, to you, Bart, to Samuel Lawrence Foundation for bringing us all together, because I'm already sitting here going, okay, here's 5 new partnerships, and here's people that that I can get to work with, right? We know what needs to be done, and we're willing to attack it together. And I'll tie that into the other piece of this, which is, again, going back to what others said about there's 100,000 people here. We get stuck up in the technology of the transition that has to happen here, but this is fundamentally a human transition. So the more people that are really paying attention, if 100,000 of us are here, and each one of us has however many people that we're impacting, then we have that opportunity not to wait for governments to move, not to wait for philanthropists to move, not to wait for old outdated structures to move, but every one of us is moving, and we're moving our communities around us. So, keeping the human at the center of this and committing our own selves to action and our communities to action is where it's at.
Those are such great words to end on, Deirdre. Thank you for that. Thank you to all 5 panelists for your amazing insights, for being here in Dubai, for making the journey here, for doing the great work you're doing, and for staying up with us late tonight to be on this important program, just so we can give a perspective to the people who are not able to be here and to let them know what it's like on the ground here. That concludes our program today. To rewatch this webinar or to see a transcript, go to the Samuel Lawrence Foundation website in the coming days. The website is samuellawrencefoundation.org, Lawrence with L-A-W. Thank you so much to Pixera Global, Blue Planet Alliance, Columbia University, Jesus Energy, and the Government of Tonga for their participation in today's event. To learn more about the critical work that all these participating parties are doing to advance renewable energy and other sustainable initiatives, and to stay informed about upcoming events and important initiatives, sign up for the newsletters of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation and Brooklyn Story Lab. That's brooklynstorylab.net. Also, make sure you join us for the next Samuel Lawrence Foundation First Friday series in 2024. Thank you guys again, and goodbye from Dubai.
Thank you, Lance.
Right, bye.